In 1913, Waltham was a very different place in some respects, and remarkably the same in others. On the south side, Waltham was still a hub of innovative businesses that manufactured textiles, watches, tools, and pipes. Small family farms on the north side still provided produce and milk to urban populations. Horses and carriages still delivered ice and milk door to door on unpaved roads. But people were living in an era of great change in 1913. The 19th century small town ways of horses and carriages or sleighs, paternalistic government, and a closed society of old-timers were giving way to new technology, new immigrants, and new ideas and forms of entertainment. This was the advent of modernism. Some aspects were not that different from today. Technological innovations were changing the daily lives of most people. Young people enthusiastically embraced the changes, while older residents resisted and were disconcerted at the new developments. The city was slowly evolving politically towards a new charter and acceptance of women in public life. Many professional women, including Waltham Historical Society members, were active in pursuing voting rights for women. So the city was on the cusp of a new modern era. In 1913, Woodrow Wilson was sworn in as the 28th President of the United States, succeeding Howard Taft. In 1913, the 16th Amendment was ratified, which allowed Congress to levy income tax without apportioning it among the states or basing it on census results. Also in this year, the Federal Reserve System was created. On March 3rd, 1913, on the day before Woodrow Wilson was inaugurated, some 5,000 supporters of women's suffrage marched down Pennsylvania Avenue. The parade was led by lawyer Inez Milholland Boissevain. But the women were jeered, tripped, grabbed, and shoved by rowdies, so that some of them weren't able to complete the route. The police did little to protect them. The mistreatment of the women caused a public outcry and increased sympathy for the movement to extend voting rights to women. Modernism had its roots in the 19th century, but by 1913, artists, writers, musicians, playwrights, and dancers were embracing a more radical change. Artist Pablo Picasso reached a turning point that moved him from analytic to synthetic cubism when he created a series of guitar collages between 1912 and 1914. So shown here is a collage of a guitar that he created in 1913. On the right, Self-Portrait with Seven Fingers was Marc Chagall's first self-portrait, and it was an early attempt to incorporate Cubism into his art. In music, Igor Stravinsky's ballet, The Rite of Spring, premiered on May 29th, 1913 in Paris. With its dissonant music and modernist choreography, the ballet was greeted with hisses and catcalls, and a near riot ensued. This performance is considered still one of the most important musical innovations in the 20th century. Ragtime music was popular at this time. Ragtime originated in African-American communities in St. Louis and New Orleans. In popular music, Peg My Heart was written by Alfred Bryan and Fred Fisher, and it was published in March of 1913. It was featured in the 1913 musical Ziegfeld Follies. It has been revived at various times, most recently in 2011 by the Dropkick Murphys. In 1913, Fred Weatherly wrote the lyrics to an old Irish tune, the Londonderry Air, and the song, Danny Boy, became an anthem for Irish Americans. In literature and drama, Willa Cather's second novel, O Pioneers, captured the story of 19th century Swedish immigrants in Nebraska as they struggled to eke out a living. The novel featured a strong female protagonist. The autobiographical book, Sons and Lovers by D.H. Lawrence, was published in 1913 and is considered one of the best novels of the 20th century. It was the first modern portrayal of the Freudian Oedipal complex. And although George Bernard Shaw wrote his most popular play, Pygmalion, in 1912, the production premiered in October 1913 in Vienna. With the growth of ragtime and popular music, dances evolved to accompany the new music. The revolution in dance originated in the lower classes, which developed the so-called animal dances, the turkey trot, the bunny hug, the grizzly bear, and the camel walk. Society couples like Irene and Vernon Castle brought the tango dance to America from Paris, and the new dances became all the rage. The tango originated in Argentina and spread to Paris by 1912. In 1913, the tango, the first couple dance that used improvisation, took the world by storm. And as we shall see later, the new dances came to Waltham as well. So let's take a look at Waltham in 1913. From 1910 to 1920, the population of Waltham, which had been at 27,790, grew by over more than 3,000 people, by 11%. Waltham attracted new immigrants who had come to America seeking jobs in Waltham's factories and farms, and they also were seeking political and religious freedom. I created this graph to show where people came from using the census records for 1910 and 1920. The largest increases were in people from Italy, Canada, Sweden, and Russia. The chart also shows a decrease from 1910 to 1920 in Irish first and second generations. But many of the Irish had immigrated in the 1840s and 50s. And so many of the Irish Americans in Waltham were now in the third generation. As we will see later, this growth in the immigrant population affected the political divisions in the city, and also law enforcement and the cultural life of the city. So what was it like to live in Waltham 100 X number of years ago, 7? Well, houses and apartments were heated by coal rather than oil and gas. Electric refrigerators had not been invented yet, and people kept their food cold with ice in ice chests. Ice was cut on local ponds and distributed by horse and carriage. Many houses were still lit by gas, but electricity was becoming increasingly common. Invented in 1876, telephones were becoming increasingly common in Waltham's houses. Cooking was done on coal stoves, and increasingly it was becoming common to have gas stoves. The first automobiles were becoming popular. Many were Model Ts, but also Metz cars. We did not have supermarkets in 1913. Food was distributed in small food stores, many specializing in meat, fish, or produce. Fresh milk was distributed door to door by local dairies, many right here in Waltham. So let's take a closer look at life in Waltham. Heat was generally by coal, and there were several coal distributors in Waltham. This is an image of a coal furnace from the Waltham City Directory. Houses often had coal bins in the basements, and the residents would have to shovel coal into the furnace periodically to keep it burning. The ashes needed to be disposed of, and they were collected by the city. In fact, the city had 3 pickups, one for ashes, one for trash, and a third for garbage. In 1913, the invention of electric refrigerators was in its infancy. Everyone used ice chests to refrigerate food. This left the crucial requisite of refrigeration for businesses, food producers, and individual households completely dependent on the fickle New England weather. The ice was cut and supplied locally by John Totten and the Waltham Ice Company. The Waltham Ice Company obtained its ice from the Charles River. They were located up where Nova Biomedical is located now. And the Waltham Ice Company supplied the meatpacking companies of Armour and Swift in Cambridge. It was owned by Jacob Peterson, who lived on Prospect Street between Vernon and Russell Streets. John Totten was the son of Irish immigrants. He flooded the area near Lincoln Street and Winter Street, and in 1909, a drought actually caused the pond to dry up. He petitioned and then got water from the city for $500. So in 1913, there was an environmental crisis. A warm winter had caused an ice shortage in Waltham. By March 7th, the Waltham Ice Company received 300 tons of ice, and 8,000 tons were due to be shipped. By June, Waltham ice dealers were importing 2 railroad cars a day from Tilton, New Hampshire. The ice shortage was of great concern to the city's dairies, which depended on ice to refrigerate the milk. The shortage and importation of ice drove up the cost of ice, and this affected everyone in the city. Although automobiles had been manufactured in America since 1893, horses and carts were still in use. Many streets were not paved, and automobiles were creating havoc with the road surfaces. On main roads, the city created macadam surfaces by spraying tar on broken stones on the streets. More and more ordinary people were purchasing automobiles, and the roads were like the Wild West. There were no traffic laws, stop signs, or even traffic lights. There were numerous accidents between other automobiles, horse-drawn carts, pedestrians, and bicycles. There were 2 forms of public transportation in Waltham: streetcar and train. Streetcar lines were much more extensive than the bus routes that we have today. This streetcar that's on the left ran between Newton and Waltham along Moody Street. And there was another line that ran along Bacon Street. Waltham had 2 railroads running through it: the Fitchburg line, and this shows the station that was located on Carter Street, and also the Mass Central Rail Trail, a rail line, which ran between North Cambridge and Northampton. And pictured here is the Linden Street Bridge, which is actually still there. And the Mass Central Rail Line we're hoping to have it become a community trail in the near future. Charles Metz had been manufacturing bicycles since the 1890s, but he started building gasoline-powered engines in 1903. In 1913, 3 teams driving the Metz Model 22 cars that we saw in a previous slide entered the Glidden Tour. This was a cross-country endurance race that ran between Minneapolis and Glacier Park, Montana. All 3 teams, Metz teams, won the race with perfect scores. The winning teams were treated to a special parade in Waltham when they returned. Infectious diseases, especially ones affecting primarily children, were common. In the previous few years, there had been outbreaks of diphtheria, measles, and typhoid fever. Typhoid was spread primarily in milk, and the city's milk inspector had worked hard to promote pasteurization, and he was successful in bringing down the rate. In 1913, there were outbreaks of measles, diphtheria, and infantile paralysis or polio. In September, there was an outbreak of polio that threatened to force the closure of the schools. Tuberculosis was still the leading cause of death in adults in Waltham. This chart shows the number of infectious diseases in the city in 1913. So telephones were becoming more widespread. Bell Telephone had been producing telephones since 1877, and it was purchased by AT&T in 1899. But it was quite a while before telephones became a fixture in every household. 1913 shows that many people were adding phones to their houses, and the newspaper printed the new telephone numbers every day in the newspapers. On the left here, we see Henry Morgenthau using a telephone that was a common model of telephone in 1913. And on the right, D.W. Griffith produced the silent movie, The Telephone and the Lady, starring Mae Marsh as a telephone operator. In 1912, Julius Sarsfield O'Connor of Woburn began organizing telephone operators in Boston. The operators were working 10-hour days and split shifts, and they formed the first union of telephone operators in the country. In 1913, they demanded an 8-hour day, the abolition of the double shift, and a pay raise, and they briefly went out on strike. They won all their demands, and their victory inspired telephone operators around the country to organize. Waltham was a thriving center of manufacturing in 1913. It had 33 manufacturing companies that produced a wide variety of products, including watches, clocks, gas pipes, emery wheels, textiles, automobiles, tools, church organs, and foundries. Some of the major companies included the Boston Manufacturing Company, the Waltham Watch Company, the Davis and Farnham Foundry, Waltham Emery Wheel, the Charles Metz Company, Waltham Bleachery and Dye Works, and the B.C. Ames Company. The Francis Cabot Lowell Mill was built by the Boston Manufacturing Company in 1814 on the site of a former paper mill and dam. So the Francis Cabot Lowell Mill was built by the Boston Manufacturing Company in 1814 on the site of a former paper mill. The company manufactured cotton textiles for 116 years and closed in 1930. Associated with the mill was the Waltham Bleachery and Dye Works, which operated from 1820 to 1951. It was located on the Charles River, where the Star Market parking lot on River Street is now. The American Waltham Watch Company, located in Waltham in 1854 and ran to 1957 along Crescent Street. And the scene on the left here shows the watch company at lunchtime, and it's a view of Crescent Street. And on the right, founded by Charles Metz in 1893 to bicycles, The Betz Company switched to making automobiles in 1903. And shown here is what they call the Sawtooth Building of the Metz Building on Sean Street. It was located where BJ's is now. The Davis and Farnham Foundry began making water and gas pipes in 1846 on Felton Street. But they moved to this site off of Willow Street. It's called Foundry Avenue in the 1860s. And this site was purchased by Raytheon in the 20th century, and there's an office building there now. We're always surprised at the low price of foods in the days of old, but of course wages were a lot lower then as well. Sirloin steak in 1913 was 20 cents a pound, and eggs were 24 cents a dozen. Without a national system of roads, food distribution was a lot more locally based. But national brands like cereals began to appear. And as we can see on the ad on the right, they're advertising for Post Toasties and grape nuts. So without a system of roads, as I said, food distribution was a lot more locally based. Fresh produce was generally available only seasonally, so that canned goods were the staples in winter. And so you could see on the left what being advertised, they have squash, salmon, raspberries, but if you look over to the right, you can see they're all canned. Refrigeration was with ice. Milk was produced by local dairies in Waltham, and it was delivered door to door on a daily basis. In 1913, dress styles were changing. The waistlines rose to an empire style, and the dresses were often slimmer and more fluid and soft. The corset changed accordingly. It was less emphasis on the tiny waistline and more on slim hips. Big hats were still the fashion in 1913. And as shown in this photo of some of the women marchers in the 1913 suffrage parade in Washington. Another favorite was the long tunic over a skirt. Hair was still upswept, but some women were trending towards the shorter bobs that marked the post-World War I era. The shirtwaist blouse and skirt were still popular for working women. The upper portion of the blouse part of it had a menswear turned over collar, and then the long sleeves were turned back at the wrist. For men, the sack coat replaced the frock coat and looked much more like the jackets we still see today. Men's pants were ankle length, creased, and cuffed. The Norfolk jacket with front pleats and a waist were used for sports. Working men often wore a sweater, a jacket, and a flat or scally cap. Here is an image from a Waltham men's store showing the Norfolk jacket on the left for golf, and then shorter trousers with cuffs. Straw border hats were still popular for summer wear for men. There were many social and civic organizations in the city, and these kept the population educated, entertained, and in contact with one another. For fraternal organizations, we had the Owl's Nest, the Eagle's Eyrie, the Moose, the Elks, 3 lodges of Oddfellows, the Redmen, the Grange, the Fales Club, the Sons of Veterans, the Knights of Pythias, the Knights of Honor, the Ancient Order of Hibernians, and 2 lodges of Masons. Women belonged to the Mothers Club, the Women's Club, the Ladies Auxiliary of the AOH, Daughters of Veterans, Daughters of St. George, Daughters of the American Revolution, and the Eastern Star. Catholics belonged to the Knights of Columbus, the St. Vincent de Paul Society, and the Holy Name Society. The Filarmonica Aragonese, which was an Italian theater company, put on a comedy in 1913 called La Pastorale. The Philocutis St. Stephen's Society celebrated their first annual ball at Lincoln Hall in 1913. Weekend dances were held at a variety of clubs and hotels in the city, and these attracted people not only from Waltham, but from the surrounding towns. Typically, the young people arrived as groups of girls and groups of boys, not as couples. There were 3 theaters in the city that showed a combination of vaudeville acts and silent movies. They were the Scenic Theater, which was at 16 Elm Street, the Orpheum Theater at 128 Moody, and the Waltham Theater. And I just want to point out that the photo here is of the what had been the Scenic Theater on Elm Street, and it has been recently refurbished by the landlord. So there was the Waltham Theater on Moody Street. It was designed by Ida and Orion, and it opened in 1913 on Moody Street near the corner of Cushing Street. This is an example on the right of what the weekend lineup was for the Waltham Theater. So these shows were extremely popular, and they attracted as many as 30,000 viewers per week. As a matter of fact, a lot of them were young people, and some parents worried whether frequent movie going would have a negative effect on their young people. And as we can see by this lineup, it's a combination of live entertainment and silent movies. There were a number of parades in Waltham for various reasons. The 4th of July, there was a horse parade that they had every year. And also they had a parade celebrating the Mets cars winning the Glidden Trophy. Sports were very popular and included not only baseball and football, but also bicycling, canoeing, bowling, and ice skating. The Waltham-Newton football game ended in a near riot, with Newton fans vandalizing the Waltham field. And on a cold January weekend in 1913, some 10,000 skaters enjoyed the winter season by skating on the Charles River. The old style of, the modern dance became a controversy in Waltham. The old style of graceful dances, such as the waltz, were supplanted by a new, livelier 1- and 2-step dances that featured couples suggestively hopping and twirling in a much closer proximity. In the spring, some high school students at a private dance were seen doing the bunny hug dance. Letter writers to the newspaper were outraged and urged that the new modern dances be banned. A teenager rebutted the letter writer by saying that young people did not want to glide, they wanted to hop, spin, and shout. Authorities reacted by stationing Waltham Police Sergeant Edward Clunan as a censor at dance halls to make sure no one was stepping the new dances. So the major issues in Waltham in 1913 were the location of a new library, a new city hall, a new city charter, the railroad grade crossings at Elm Street and Moody Street, female department supervisors, the women's right to vote, or lack of right to vote, illegal liquor sales, control over the Charles River, and unions who went on strike. Mayor Patsy Duane was finishing out his term of office in Waltham and did not run for re-election in 1913. He had been born in Doneraile, County Cork in 1862, and he was the son of David Duane and Mary Cahill, Irish immigrants who had come to Waltham in 1864. Over his political career, he was a lawyer, alderman, city solicitor, state representative, judge of the Waltham District Court, and mayor. He died in 1949 at the age of 86. He lived on Cushing Street initially, and later at 202 Main Street. In 1913, the Board of Aldermen consisted of 5 Democrats, 14 Republicans, and 2 progressives. In 1913, the city took up the task of changing the city's charter. A committee was established and public meetings were held to discuss the options. Since the aldermen and the mayor were divided both by party affiliation and ethnicity, both Duane and Kearns were Democrats, but the majority of aldermen were Republicans. Politics in Waltham could get quite nasty. And as we will see in the controversy over women department supervisors. Some elections were very close, and opponents called for recounts. In the December 1913 election, Thomas Stearns, who had been city solicitor with Duane, won the election for mayor by 89 votes. Kearns ran for re-election in 1914 and lost. He was last seen on December 30th, 1914, and his body was found in the Charles River several days later. The implication was that he had committed suicide. Women were becoming a political force in Waltham. The Waltham Equal Suffrage League supported Mrs. Helen Stearns for school committee, and she ended up being the top vote getter for school committee election. In that year, women could vote in the school committee elections, but not in other elections. In 1913, Democrats increased their representation on the Board of Aldermen to 8 seats, and the progressives lost out to the Republicans. The issue of whether Waltham was to continue as a dry town was put to a referendum, and the voters rejected allowing liquor. The 3rd ward, by the way, was the Bleachery district. So the biggest support for allowing liquor in the city was in the Bleachery and the Chemistry districts. In 1899, the estate of Francis Buttrick offered the city $40,000 for the erection of a new library on the Central House lot. And the Central House lot is shown on the left here. It was between Exchange Street and Spring Street on Main Street. In 1913, the need for a new library and a new city hall were debated extensively, and the issue was put to the voters in a special referendum, and in which women were also allowed to vote. 47% of the votes were cast by women. The voters agreed to a new library, but they wanted a postponement of the city hall. Among the proposed sites for the new library were the west side of the Waltham Common and the Central House block. This map, as I said, shows that this whole block was actually owned by the Francis Buttrick estate. Since Buttrick had left a large sum of money to the city to erect a new library, the estate trustees favored this site, and so did the voters. The library was built in the following year, 1914, at this site. And that library is still there today. So for several years, a statewide railroad commission had been planning the elimination of grade crossings, including ones in Waltham. The commission wanted to eliminate the Elm Street crossing altogether so that no one would be able to actually cross the tracks there. For Moody Street, the commission wanted to elevate Moody Street from Charles Street all the way to Crescent Street at Hall's Corner. So the diagram at the top shows the proposed elevation of Moody Street. And as you can see that it's almost 2 stories above where it was then and where it is now. So the elevated roadway would have cut off several businesses that were nearest the tracks and river. They wouldn't have been able to have access to Moody Street. So everyone in the city was against the grade crossing elimination. But the issue was actually squelched by the year's end, because the B&M Railroad declared that it had no money for crossing abolition. So the whole thing died. Today, the crossings are not really a big problem, but then there were 30 trains a day running through Waltham. And the planners, unfortunately, did not see that the reduction of train transportation would happen as a result of automobile and truck transportation increasing. And certainly it would have been a drastic solution to what turned out to be a short-term problem. In January 1913, Mayor Patrick Duane appointed Ida Ann Orion as supervisor of the building department. Ida Ann Orion had graduated from MIT School of Architecture in 1908 and had worked as a builder and an architect in Waltham. She would have been the first instance of a female supervisor in a municipal department in the entire state. Her appointment was opposed by several members of the Board of Aldermen, who pointed out that female departmental supervisors were illegal in Massachusetts. So the mayor, by the way, defended Ms. Ryan, saying that not only did he think women could be good supervisors, but that a woman could even be mayor. Mayor Duane and City Solicitor Thomas Stearns then had a bill introduced into the state legislature, which would have allowed women to become departmental supervisors. The bill quickly passed the legislature without opposition. But then the Waltham Board of Aldermen opposed and voted against her appointment. The vote was divided along party lines. With the opposition of the aldermen, the bill stalled in the Senate and it was never passed. Ida Ann Orion was born in Waltham in 1873 and was the daughter of Waltham Historical Society founder and our first curator, Albert Ryan. She attended Waltham schools and she became inspired to become an architect while she was still in high school. She attended the MIT School of Architecture and received a master's degree of science in 1908. She was the first woman to receive a master's degree in science from MIT, and she was one of the first women in the country to earn a master's degree in architecture. She began her architectural practice in Waltham and became a partner with Florence Luscombe, who later became a well-known suffragist. Ida herself was a member of the Waltham Equal Suffrage League. We'll see some of her buildings in a minute. She was not allowed to become a member of the State Architectural Society solely because she was female. And because of this, she moved to Orlando, Florida in 1917. In Florida, Ida formed a partnership with Isabel Roberts, who had studied under Frank Lloyd Wright. And here is Isabel and Ida in later years. Ida died in Florida in 1950, and she's buried in the Grove Hill Cemetery in Waltham. So these are some of her buildings. The Ryans lived at 21 Hammond Street. The house is still there. And in 1908, they lived next door to the Prospect House barn. The barn was not being used except for storage by the city. So Ida proposed an affordable housing renovation to the barn. In the top left is an image of the barn as it was originally. And at the bottom left is the barn that was in the process of being renovated into 9 apartments. So that building actually still stands there today, although there are 8 apartments in the building now. So Ida Ann Ryan also built the Waltham Theater, which opened in 1913 on Moody Street between Cushing and Taylor Streets. The theater building is actually still there at 408 Moody Street under a much altered facade. It's the vape shop on Moody Street. And you can see that when you look at there, all the columns that were there in the foyer of the theater. She liked to use arched entryways on stucco houses, such as the house on the right. That house was at, and still is there, at 228 Hammond Street. The bottom left house is still standing there today at 19 Boynton Street. She built that house for her sister and brother-in-law. There's actually an interactive map showing all the buildings that were designed by Ida Ann Ryan or built or renovated. And the interactive map is on the website stonehurst.org. In Waltham, the Women's Equal Suffrage League supported Mrs. Charles Stearns, or Helen Stearns, to run for school committee, with the result that Stearns was the top vote getter. Ida Hall, who was a lawyer living on Chesterbrook Road, was the president of the Women's Equal Suffrage League, the Waltham's Equal Suffrage League. And her sister, Josephine, was a corresponding secretary of the organization. She was a teacher in the high school. Nora Smiley, one of the founders of Waltham Historical Society, was the recording secretary. And Elizabeth McCarthy, the wife of the first parish church minister, was the second vice president. The women held meetings and a rally on Waltham Common in 1913. And these 2 photos were taken in the following year and showed a suffrage parade in Waltham. And the float was designed by Ida Ann Ryan. These 2 photos are from the Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe. The issue of liquor had long been contentious in Waltham, and the temperance movement dated back to the 1830s. But with the arrival of the Irish, attitudes towards liquor became divisive. In 1882, the Waltham Town Meeting voted no license, but this was reversed in the following year. In 1892, Waltham again voted no license, and again it was reversed. But in 1900, Waltham became a no license town, and this continued until Prohibition ended. The attitude towards liquor had its roots in cultural attitudes. Although Waltham was a dry town in 1913, many citizens skirted the law. Irish women, particularly widows, ran shebeens, which were informal bar rooms in their front parlors of the houses. And this was a way that they were able to support their families. By 1913, Italian shopkeepers, especially ones with fruit stands, were also selling beer on the side. The Waltham police were charged with enforcing the liquor laws, and raids upon houses and shops were common. Many of the illicit liquor dealers used what they termed Pony Express delivery services. And I'm going to show you in the next slide some of the reports of these raids in 1913. So on the left, the police had been watching a store on the corner of Moody and Chestnut Streets. The owners were charged with dealing liquor. A driver for Gibbs Express turned state's evidence against them. In the middle article, A man who had a fruit stand on Main Street was charged with having a keg of beer. And on the right, a woman living on Calvary Street was caught transporting liquor from Boston to Waltham on the train for her neighbor. The neighbor didn't keep the liquor in his house, so that when the house was raided, the police wouldn't find anything. It was next door at the neighbor's house. The police claimed that the man was selling liquor by the glass, and also 2 or 3 gallons of whiskey per day. The textile mills of the Boston Manufacturing Company were water powered, although steam power was just coming in at that time. And the dam at Moody Street was used to regulate the water for the mill. The company would hold back the water in the rainy season of the spring and then slowly drain it down in the dry season of the summer. During the summer, the river would become quite shallow. The riverbed and banks were exposed and smelly, and they attracted a large number of flies and mosquitoes. The Metropolitan Parks Commission wanted to establish minimum and maximum levels for the river, but they were unable to reach an agreement with the Boston Manufacturing Company. A bill was submitted to the legislature in 1913, but the commission opposed it because it only gave them the rights to negotiate. They wanted the power of eminent domain to take control of the river. So the action was deferred until a later year. So this is an image for our final slide of the same view of Central Square in Waltham, looking west. And as we could see in the old days, we had the horse and carriage. We had, if you look at, there are telephone poles lining the street. The Methodist building was on the corner, and just behind it was the Congregational Church. The building on your right, I noticed, and I'm thinking that actually the modern building that's there now, it might just be the same building with a facade built on the front, because the number of windows are the same and they're placed in the same place. The Lawrence building was still there as well. And so, but what we do see striking is, first of all, there is a trolley in the middle of the main street, and there's no traffic. Now, of course, what we see are the telephone poles are gone because they're underground. There are traffic lights because in the 1913, they didn't have traffic lights. And there's a huge amount of traffic, automobiles that are traveling on Main Street. Interestingly enough, the Congregational Church spire is still there. And also the Merck building took its inspiration from the design of the Methodist building, but in a more modern fashion. So let us reflect on the times in which Waltham inhabitants lived in the early 20th century. We will understand that while their lives were quite different from ours, we also had much in common, especially in our appreciation of our local heritage. So thank you for coming to our lecture tonight, and I'll be available to answer some questions.